So they all did exactly the same thing. The New York Times even published those documents before WikiLeaks, so did The Guardian. And yet only out of all those people, all those media organizations, the only one that's been prosecuted is WikiLeaks. The only thing they have to go on from this conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, it's a conspiracy charge. And by the way, their indictment is a theory because they haven't proven it. So they have a theory about a conspiracy. Could call them a conspiracy theorist, the government. And they base it all on this Jabber chat, this encrypted chat that a person called Nobody had with a person called Nathaniel Frank. It came out in Chelsea Manning's trial that was Chelsea Manning discussing with someone at WikiLeaks. This was after, by the way, she went to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and they didn't want her Iraq and Afghan war files, so she went to WikiLeaks, not as the first choice. And there was a conversation between Chelsea Manning and someone called Nathaniel Frank. Now, it seems to be clear that well, it could be somebody at WikiLeaks because we're out of the context of the conversation. But it's never been proven, although many assume. I even assumed that, but it's not proven legally that Nathaniel Frank was Julian Assange. So therefore, if they go to court, they can't say that Assange conspired with her to get these classified documents. That's number one. They can't even identify who she was speaking with in this conspiracy. But number two, it came out and it was highly complex and technical testimony, but it's the bottom line was she didn't need a password to get classified defense information. She had access to that legally. The indictment says that. The indictment says she had access to all these documents. She didn't need Assange to help her crack a password to get it. Well, the day he was arrested and pulled out of the embassy in April of 2019, the New York Times, the Post, the Washington Post, lots of media around the world decried this as a threat to press freedom. Even Rachel Maddow, who despises Julian Assange for what she thinks is putting Trump in the White House, she even said that this, as much as she disliked him, that this was a threat to what she does, what her job is, what journalists do. And then it just all went away. And now this hearing was resumed. It started in February. It was resumed. It was delayed because of the lockdown in Britain. And there was one New York Times story, staff story, when it began, and then almost nothing after that. And I presume there's going to be one when the judgment is made, which is January 4th, 2021. The Guardian is really the paper you have to look at because the prosecution, that's the US government and their British lawyers, have relied heavily on this book by David Lee and Luke Harding about WikiLeaks. And it's a long story on that, but they published the password to these unredacted cables that were encrypted, which allowed anyone to publish the diplomatic cables with the names of informants in there, and the government made such a big deal about the informants. We could talk about that if we have time. And none have been harmed, by the way, and others published before Assange. Guardian just responsible for that charge, which was publishing with the New York Times, with Der Spiegel, with El País. They published the same exact stories of the same documents, many of the same documents, around the Iraq War and the Afghan War, the war diaries and war logs. So they all did exactly the same thing. The New York Times even published those documents before WikiLeaks, so did The Guardian. And yet only out of all those people, all those media organizations, the only one that's been prosecuted is WikiLeaks. They have those anonymous witness statements from one former partner and one former employee of this company, UC Global, which was contracted by the Ecuadorian government to provide security at the embassy, their embassy in London, and also to protect the family of the president. Of course, who was living in the Ecuadorian embassy? Julian Assange for 7 years. So while he was in there, the security was put in. Suddenly, David Morales, the founder and the owner, the partner of one of the anonymous witnesses, and the British judge here, Vanessa Barreza, had to first agree to allow them to testify anonymously, which he did. Morales started going to the US and he came back saying, we're playing in the big leagues now. We've moved to the dark side. We have American friends. We're going to get us contracts. And then progressively they wanted more bugs put in there. They took out the cameras that originally Ecuadorian government had contracted for, which only provided video. And without telling the Ecuadorian government, they were able to replace these cameras with audio. There was an attempt, it's not clear whether it happened, to have 24/7 streaming back to serve to the US. In the meantime, Morales would take the hard drives with all this video and audio. Every 2 weeks, someone would go to London, get this hard drive, bring it back to Spain, and he would fly to the US and give it to his American friends. One of the witnesses, the anonymous witnesses, said in the testimony that we heard in court on Wednesday, said that he asked point blank to Morales, "Who are your American friends?" And he said US intelligence. And then this employee anonymously asked him who, more specifically, what part of the American intelligence, and he was cut off at that point. So it's been reported and said that it was the CIA. I think it very likely was the CIA. It could probably only have been the CIA, which also has a huge electronic gathering unit that never talked about, or the NSA, which of course is only dedicated to electronic intercepts. So it was either the NSA or the CIA, and I think it's the CIA because Pompeo, this thing all started happening, the replacement of the cameras, the intense focus on getting lawyer conversations, attorney privileged conversations between Assange and his lawyers. That's what they really wanted. This is what the witness said. And they stole legal documents out of the embassy. They wanted to spy. This is the prosecuting government. An intelligence arm of the prosecuting government eavesdropped on the defense preparations for this very hearing that we've just gone through. This is an unbelievable illegal act that would be thrown out of any court. Now, Daniel Ellsberg, when he read my reports, he wrote to me and a few others saying that what he learned about their spying on Assange, stealing the documents, also his doctor visits, journal, everything. They even put a bug inside the toilet there where he used to go to try to have private conversations. They also discussed trying to maybe kidnap or poison him. This was discussed. This is Morales telling this witness who's testified down in Spain and now in the British court. Ellsberg says, quote, "That's essentially the same information that ended my case and confronted Nixon with impeachment leading to his resignation." In other words, Julian may miraculously walk free on the basis of this, eventually, just as I did. Now, what happened in Ellsberg's case in 1971, of course, he was standing trial in a Los Angeles courtroom for leaking the Pentagon Papers to various newspapers. And the Nixon administration desperately wanted to punish him, but it became known that his psychiatrist's office was broken into. They tried to get his medical records to smear him. They also had illegal wiretaps on his phone, and they tried to bribe the judge in his case with the FBI directorship. When this became known, the judge had to throw the case out immediately and said it was an offense to the sense of justice. And that was 40 years ago. So is it the same thing going to happen now? This is the question. November 16th, we're going to have the final submissions, they call it in Britain. We call it closing arguments in the US. 2 weeks after that, the prosecution will submit their closing arguments. Unfortunately, they will be written. The government wanted written, the US government, and they're going to be written submissions. We're told they're going to be made public, but we're not going to get to see the two lawyers stand up in court and make their final arguments. We're going to hopefully get those documents on November 16th, the defense. 2 weeks after that, the prosecution. And then on January 4th, I spoke before, January 4th, 3 days after New Year's, Barreza will re-enter that courtroom in the Old Bailey in London and give us her decision. But whoever loses is very likely to appeal, and this can go on for years.